Okay, Mark, why don't you take us through the importance of the term of the lease?
We're identifying how long the lease is going to be. Typically, you're going to run into 3 to 10 years. Anytime that's outside a rent abatement period, if that happens to be in your market. The key is tying that from a tenant perspective and a landlord as well, I guess, is tying the commencement to completion of the tenant improvements plus time to move in. In some cases, you can have hard dates, but that would depend upon whether the condition of the space. If the space has got minor improvements to do and you feel comfortable with that, and it's vacant, you can feel comfortable with that. If it's tied to a tenant improvement, maybe it's shell space, or they're coming to a complete renovation, then you want time for the build out to occur. You don't want to have to pay rent as a tenant until you're actually occupying and enjoying the space. So that's key. You want to negotiate the ability also to terminate if a landlord doesn't complete the premises by an outside date. Now you have to give a pretty generous amount of time, because that's a bad day for everybody. For the landlord, because they've wasted this money, for the tenant because they have to start the process over and hold over where they are or something, and that's the worst case scenario. But I have seen it happen. If you're in this business long enough, you will see it, where a landlord gets in financial straits or something happens where they don't complete their building, and you need the ability to pull a ripcord at some point to go elsewhere.
So I'm coming back to the Coral Springs building, where you were one of several tenants. You were ground floor, signage, drive-throughs, very high rent. If you were going to start out a lease with knowing that whatever the landlord's tenant improvement allowance was, it was just going to be a fraction of what you were probably going to spend on all of your tenant improvements and signage and drive-throughs and FF&E. Why? Tell me about what kind of a term you would want to have with a known rental rate, as opposed to a renewal with a market rate.
A renewal? Okay.
A fixed term, in other words.
Right.
10, 15, 5, what's your choice?
Bank of America, as that example, they liked fixed rental rates. At the end of the day, the rent, as high as it was just a small fraction of their business. Their business was deposits and loans and whatnot. So they would do typically 25 to 50 years of fixed rent increases. And you can look out at 20 years and say, wow, that's a really high rental rate. It's also, if it gets completely sideways and the market is much lower than the rental rate, you can always go back and try to renegotiate. But at the end of the day, you're making a substantial investment between vaults and equipment and whatnot. Typical build out is $40-50. A branch typical build out is $300 a foot or more. So it's the rent was the smallest part of it. So they liked fixed rental rates as long as you could get. And I think I shared with you before, they even had a little plaque that they had at one point. They called it the Century Club on land leases and other things. If you get 100 years of fixed rental, increases, they pat you on the back for that, which is crazy, but they did.
And if you were to do a 15-year lease, would the increases be every 5 years or annually, or what was the better thing for the tenant?
What they'd like to do would be like 10% every 5 years, as opposed to annual.
So from your perspective as a landlord,
He's shy by like 5 more percent. I like 15% myself. So no, from the landlord perspective, I think it's good to understand who your landlord is. So a TA is more of an institutional landlord, and our business models tends to, at some point, we will trade that asset. So you may have a landlord who is, has that asset held in an estate, and they may have a different objective to it. So my answer is predicated on who your landlord is and what their specific strategy is for that building. So from a TA perspective or more institutional landlord perspective, it's better to have the options or rights based on a market-based rent, because it's all about apportionment of risk and who should take that risk on. So, what Mark described for his client, they want to control their own corporate and business risks by understanding and be able to predict the cash flow for the rent. Whereas from my perspective, it's a little bit different in that I'm looking to achieve the best I can at market. That is my objective. So whether that I can guess right or wrong today on a renewal 10 years from now, I'm not smart enough to figure that out. So I would prefer to have it float, so to speak, at market.
And for an arm's length tenant, meaning not necessarily an anchor or a bank, just a typical 5,000 square foot tenant in a 100,000 square foot building,
Mm-hmm.
would you rather see a 5-year and a 5-year option, or would you rather see a 10-year lease if you can get it?
That answer actually depends. Depends on what my strategy is for the building. So what I mean by that, if I'm looking to liquidate that building, say in the next year or two, then I have to look at how that lease rollover looks. So I try to manage for not necessarily a high concentration of tenants rolling in the same period. So that's how I would have to look at it. So it really just depends.
Right.
And also it depends on the credit of a tenant. So you may have a smaller tenant, but it would say outstanding credit and it lends a little more prestige to your building. That's certainly a tenant you want to be able to lock in for a long time.
Okay. Anything to add?
Understand the difference between the lease commencement date and the rent commencement date. This goes back to what Mark was talking about before, and it's perhaps one of the most important provisions in any lease, because when the tenant starts to pay rent is really, really important. So there are a couple scenarios that can work out here. If the landlord is doing the build-out work, you have a typical, obviously, 5,000 square foot law firm, and the landlord's doing the TI work, then the lease commencement date is going to be the date that the landlord delivers the space to the tenant, ready for the tenant to occupy it and do business in there. The rent commencement date, putting abatements aside for a second, is that same day. The landlord's going to say to the tenant, I've turnkeyed your space, here it is, time for you to go. Now you may have like a 30-day period for the tenant to come in and fixture and cable, that kind of stuff. But it's really important that you define the lease commencement date and the rent commencement date in that scenario very specifically. Let's flip that around. If the tenant's doing the build-out work, the landlord's going to say, I'm going to deliver you the space with, the VAV box is done, demising walls up, and the door in the lobby, and then you, Mr. Tenant, have all the time that you want to build out your space. Except your rent's going to commence on the earlier to occur between the date you open for business or a fixed date. Let's say you give the tenant 90 days to do the building. So you sign the lease on January 1st, January, February, March. April 1st is your rent commencement date. So if you're done or not, it's not my problem. You start paying your rent on April 1. It's really important that you get all that stuff tied down in the lease with real specificity, because I've seen a lot of leases come across my desk that I didn't do, or guys on my team didn't do, where the rent commencement date isn't real clear when it's supposed to start. And that's when guys like Nat get really, really mad, because they're expecting that cash flow to start on a date certain, and if the tenant says, well, the lease isn't clear, I still have time before I have to start paying you, that's not a good situation. So pay real careful. And the other thing is, you want the lease to commence when the tenant's in there, because you want the tenant to be bound by the insurance provisions, the indemnity provisions, the conduct and the building provisions. So they're doing all their stuff, they're occupying the space, they're just not paying rent yet. So the lease has to commence, the legal contract has to be in place, even though they're not necessarily paying rent yet. So pay real careful attention to lease commencement date and rent commencement date. And the last point is, when does the term start? The landlord really wants the term to start when the tenant starts paying the rent. So that 5-year term or that 10-year term kind of triggers off, 60 months from the date, from the rent commencement date. A lot of times we try to sneak it in. That way you sort of back end the lease.
How do you feel about early termination provisions?
I don't feel anything about it. I don't like them.
You don't like them?
I don't prefer. No, the early terminations are a very, certainly a market-dependent issue, and I would say during the downturn, certainly we have had to have allowed a lot more early termination provisions. I think depending on in today's market, depending on where you're at, those have certainly subsided. There's still instances on a specific tenant depending on their particular leverage or depending on their size. They're going to be an anchor tenant within that particular project. You would allow for that. But functionally, early terminations, what ends up happening is that it devalues the building by even allowing that provision to be in a lease. And the reason being is when you go to value it or a bank goes to lend on it, they'll anchor on that particular date as the certainty of cash flow. And that's why as landlords, we tend not to prefer them.
And I think that some brokers think that because they were able to get a penalty of unamortized TI or abatement or fees, that it's okay. And it's truly a concession, just like abatement would be a concession that you're making as a landlord.
Absolutely, and I think another nuance to that is, let's say you have again, to your example, 100,000 square foot project, and maybe you're representing a 5,000 square foot client. So it's not a significant component, it's a functional space, so in theory the landlord should be able to release it. But the other element that is often overlooked is that while the cash flow is great for that penalty, as a landlord, I've already dumped in the TIs for that tenant and then my cost basis has risen. So the more money I keep piling that, it becomes harder and harder for me to achieve my yield hurdles that I need to accomplish.
Right. Okay. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay.
I'm sorry to just keep putting stuff, but again, the termination fee, really, really important. When you grant the tenant the termination or early termination right, make sure, number one, you say you're going to pay me a fee, and number two, calculate the fee. You should be able to figure out, again, you're going to say you get to terminate the lease at the end of the 3rd year. Do the math, put the termination fee in as to what it's going to be. And then the other thing is make sure that the termination fee is due and payable on the date the tenant exercises the option. They don't get to exercise the option and pay later. They got to put their money where their mouth is. So make sure that when they send the notice, they're also sending the check for the termination fee. And then again, tie the termination right back to the surrender provisions of the